Hello and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety in Canada podcast. I'm your host, Marianne Baton, and today I am really thrilled to welcome Valerie Pruegger here. And Valerie is going to talk to us about her lifetime work on diversity and inclusion. And really, I'm going to start it off, Valerie, by asking you, what's the connection between inclusion and psychological health and safety?
Well, we know that if people don't feel included, they feel that they're not participating as much in an organization. They don't feel they can bring their whole self to the organization. And so that sense of belonging that we hear so much about now isn't there. And we also know that there's a lot of mental health outcomes and also physical health outcomes for people who experience discrimination, exclusion in our society. So that plays out in our workplaces as well.
Yeah, so it's completely aligned with, included, embedded in psych health and safety. So we've got that clear. Now tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you come to be a specialist in inclusion?
Well, my mom would argue that I came out of the womb carrying a stick for social justice. So it seems to be a part of my DNA all my life. I was always interested in how other people were treated and discrimination. And I started to make that part of my career when I went back to school, went to university and did a degree in cross-cultural and organizational psychology. And then started working with various organizations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and trying to really get them to develop systemic plans, not just have it on the side of somebody's desk or some talking points, but really embedding it into their organizational culture and how they do business. It becomes organic. It becomes part of who they are as an organization.
So tell me a little bit more about that. How do you make inclusion not some nice, pithy words on a poster, but actually embedded into the DNA of an organization?
Yeah, well, what I do with my clients is I talk about, most of the time a client brings you in to do training and it's one-off. And that's just not enough. It gives people a little door that they can peek through, but it really doesn't get them into a space where they're learning at a deep level and developing the skills that they need to be interacting effectively with people from different backgrounds. So it really doesn't matter if it's ethnocultural differences or generational differences or gender differences. We communicate differently. We have different expectations, work values, and whatnot. So we talk about that. But more importantly, I really try to get them to understand the importance of embedding this as part of their operational decision making as any other line of business that they might have. So, whatever your organization's purpose is, you need to embed DEI into every aspect of that. So it's in your promotional, hiring, firing, performance management. It's embedded in how you treat your employees. So everything you do, every line of business, it becomes part and parcel of your organization. So it's not something you think about as separate. It's something that we just do because that's what our organization does.
Yeah. I remember when I was in university and really believing in my heart that I had no bias. And then learning that idea is just ignorance, that of course we have bias. We have bias because of the way we were raised, because of the things that we watch on television, because of the books that we read, because of everything that is our world, and that we don't notice the people who are not included. If we're included, we just assume that other people have a similar experience. So how do you take a leader who has really good intentions and help them understand what they're missing?
A lot of work I've been doing in the last year or so has been around bias and doing workshops around bias. And I actually call them "I'm biased and so are you." And one of the first questions I ask people is, "Are you biased?" And we see how many hands go up. And some people are reluctant, but most people kind of go, yeah, I probably am, but I don't know how. And so what we do is we talk about the how our brain works and the neurological underpinnings of bias so that we can get away from people feeling, oh, I'm a terrible person because I'm biased. We move into, oh, I'm biased because I have a brain, because I'm a human being. And we actually have found that some animals that are sentient also have biases. So it's in our it's part of our neurological structure for a variety of reasons. And so if we can get people to be comfortable with that idea, then we can also stop them and say, well, it's not enough to say, oh, well, I'm just biased because my brain works that way. No. Now we've got to go, yes, but you also have a frontal cortex and you have the ability to think and to reason, to take a breath, to think about what you're doing. And that's when you can start to unlearn our biases. So bias in itself may not be a bad thing because sometimes our biases keep us safe. There's a survival mechanism to it here. But what happens in a pluralistic society is some of our biases that are evolutionarily programmed lead us to treat people in exclusionary ways. And that's just not acceptable anymore. It's not something that we need to keep ourselves safe. So now we have to learn how to unlearn those things that come to the front of our mind really quickly. And it happens when we're anxious. It happens when we're nervous and we're constantly making quick decisions. If we can just take a step back, and that's why we hear so much about mindfulness now. Mindfulness is really taking that breath, taking a step back and examining, is this something that I really need to do in this moment?
That's so beautiful, because that is it. It's not, I think about the book White Fragility, and I think that was, again, a wake-up call for me to think, yeah, we're so busy trying to say, no, we're good people, that we don't stop to think about what might be happening, how others might feel. So Valerie, share with me some of the most common ways that implicit, unconscious, unintentional bias plays out in the workplace.
Well, oftentimes there'll be things like just simple things like who goes to lunch with who goes to coffee with whom, who do you invite to different things? And so if you're a newbie to the organization, oftentimes you're not in on those. We're in high school, come on, in organizations, right? We have cliques, we have little pods that we move around in. And so if people who have been there a while don't actually reach out to include somebody, then they may be out on the margins. And the more that they may be different in whatever way from the larger group, the more likely that they're going to be pushed out on the margins. So one of the easiest things we can do in our organization is make sure that we are including people in our conversations, that we're including them in those kinds of invitations and taking into account what differences might be playing out. So I think about a lunch that we went to when I was working at the City of Calgary, and one of our colleagues was Muslim. And we had thought about a variety of things to make sure that she was included in the lunch, but we didn't think about having a halal kitchen. And so she wasn't able to eat at the lunch. And so just stretching our minds about what it is that we need to do to make sure people are included is important. But then, more importantly, it's important to think about individual bias, but we really have to think about systemic bias and how those hidden policies, practices, and procedures can exclude people. So I hearken back to a colleague of mine who was lesbian, and she actually and her partner worked to bring same-sex benefits to the City of Calgary. They fought for that inclusion, but at the time, this was going back many years now, but at the time, the benefits said, gender binary, he, her, get these benefits, but they didn't have anything for same-sex couples. So it's really a way of looking at our organizations, looking at, are there barriers? Are there ways that we're excluding people without intention, just the way we've always done things. And guess what? Now that we're bringing women into the workplace, we got to do things a little bit differently for whatever reason. So those are the sorts of things, is just starting to be more aware, look around and starting to see how we're excluding people, even on an unintentional level.
Yeah, I often say that what we need to do with psych health and safety is simply ask the question, how might this plan, policy, decision, interaction, team meeting, event impact the psychological health and safety of employees? And that, more than anything, that could revolutionize the workplace. And I think what you're saying is maybe we ask a question like, who are we not taking into account? Who might we be excluding? Who may we not be thinking about in this policy, plan, change, decision? And that could change it quite a bit. Valerie, the term belonging may seem too touchy-feely for some organizational leaders. How can you explain belonging in a way that makes sense to a business owner who's interested, rightly so, on the sustainability and the excellence of the work that's getting done?
Well, I think it goes back to what you just said around psychological safety. So a lot of organizations are starting to include in their safety moments psychological safety, and those that are doing diversity and inclusion work well are including that in their psychological safety moments. So starting to get people to recognize that psychological safety involves feeling included, feeling that sense of belonging. So if I'm encountering somebody who goes, oh, sense of belonging, what's that? First of all, there's a lot of stuff being written on it right now, and some of the mental health benefits. And when we see organizations that are really working hard to develop their mental health strategies, so for example, the University of Calgary developed a very strong mental health strategy, then you're starting to see that kind of terminology becoming more acceptable. But we've been using sense of belonging in organizations for a long time. We've been calling it loyalty. We've been calling it employee satisfaction, those sorts of words. So we can use those words if that makes somebody more comfortable. But I think there's something that resonates with us as people. When I hear a sense of belonging, it really kind of hits me. Not at the intellectual level, it kind of hits me at the emotional, psychological level, because I know what it feels like to belong, and I know what it feels like not to belong. And I think we've all had experiences with that. So when I talk to people, I get them to think about a time when they didn't feel that they belonged to a group, because we're social animals. We want to belong to, we're on a continuum. I always say I'm happy being a hermit in a forest somewhere. And my best friend, she just loves, having people around her. So we are on a continuum, but we do like to feel included in some places. We do like to feel that sense of belonging. And it's a very important aspect of our being. And so I think people get what that means. They may not like the language if they're not into touchy-feely, but then you just change it to other kinds of words that make them feel comfortable. But really, everybody that I pose that question to can think of a time when they were excluded. And then I talk about, well, let's look at people who are excluded on a daily basis because of their skin color, because of their sexual or gender orientation, because of whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. That was beautifully said. I really think that we could even go a step further and talk about our work productivity, our energy, our focus when we feel like we belong versus when we feel excluded. And that for any of us, we do our best work when we feel part of something. So
absolutely. And so that was the business case that we were always building, in the last 10 years to get companies on board. Here's how creating an inclusive organization is going to increase productivity. It's going to increase job satisfaction. It's going to increase retention. It's going to decrease sick and accident. You could show very clearly through metrics the benefits of a well-handled inclusion package. And I kind of get away from the word diversity because it implies a norm. It implies that we're diverse from something. So what is it that we're holding up as the norm? So I sort of focus more on inclusion and equity. Although people know what diversity means, it always seems a little bit exclusionary to me, because it says, well, here's this thing over here and you're diverse from that.
Yeah.
And we know that thing over here is, white males in our society, white heterosexual, able-bodied males, and they're not homogeneous, right? And so we kind of put them into this block category that's them, and that's not them. They're so different as everybody else. And so if we're not including them in this package of inclusion, if we're not including them as people who are just as unique and have just as many issues kind of impacting their day-to-day, then we lose such powerful allies. So that to me is a really important part of taking out the word diversity and talking about inclusion. This is something that involves us all. And if we're all not committed to creating an environment where people can have an equitable and fair experience in the workplace, and then we're going to perpetuate the status quo.
Yeah, very beautifully said, because that's really dealing with the backlash where some white men feel like now the scales are tipped against them, rather than saying, that we all need to be included. We all need to be included in a way. But then how do you level the playing field for those who have been disadvantaged, marginalized for so long, without it feeling like white men are being disadvantaged?
Well, I think the more you bring people into the fold, the more they'll recognize that there's an issue. So I'm going to go back 30 years at least to the city of Calgary, and they had a diversity council, and one of the first they even had equity groups at the time. So they had an Indigenous group, wasn't called that at the time. They had a group for women. I think they had a racial group, and in the women's group, there was a woman that was appointed to a position, and two white fellows were quite vocal about she only got the position because she was a woman. Now she was a white woman too, so there's that privilege. But she got the position because she's a woman, and it wasn't fair, and there were better suited men for that role. Blah blah blah. So instead of jumping on these guys and pushing them out, the coordinator said, look, why don't you go investigate this and see how she got the role and whether this really was appropriate. So these two fellows went away, looked into it, and came back quite shamefacedly and said she was the right person for the job. Well, those two men stayed with the city for a long time, rose up through the ranks, and became two of the biggest champions of DEI at the city of Calgary, because they hadn't been pushed away. They hadn't been told that they were privileged. They had just been, let's look at the facts. And they were able to say, yeah, there's a problem here. So I think that's my approach to it all, is that we all are in different parts of this journey, and we all have to be as kind as we can to people who may not quite be ready to take the first step. But I think for the most part that I've seen in my work, most people are on board. They just don't know what to do, and they're scared. They're scared to take that first step because they're scared they're going to make a mistake. And so I always talk about humility and being able to laugh at yourself, because I've done this work a long time and I still make mistakes. And I'm going forward. And you just have to say, as my colleague Shirley Bonner Wilson will say, you just have to say, oops, I'm sorry. What did I do? Can I do better? And move on.
I think that last piece is it, though. Can I do better? We had a roundtable, which was mostly focused on trans and non-binary. And all of my life, I've used the phrase, you guys. And to me, you guys means anybody, right? It doesn't matter what gender you are. But somebody vocalized that can feel exclusionary if you're a trans woman with a bunch of men. And I thought about it, and I was talking to my adult son about it, and he said, well, they just have to learn that's not what you mean. And you just, you're not intending to hurt anybody. And I said, I don't think that's good enough. I think I now know better, and I need to try to do better, and that we all do, right? It's just like, oh, sweetie, you don't worry your pretty little head about it. Might have been a very caring, compassionate approach at some point, but I would consider it an insult. And I don't think it's enough to say, well, they meant it this way or they meant it that way. I think that now not worrying my pretty little head is an insult, and people need to learn that, right?
Yeah, well, I think back to when I was young and I was 5'1" and tiny, and men would pick me up and move me. They'd pat me on the head. This was in an organization, like this is in the workplace. And they were not being awful or mean or horrible. They were just being fun. They thought they were being funny, but it really removed some of my agency, and I felt like a child. And so, yeah, I had to stand up for myself on those sorts of things. But I think you would never find that in the workplace now. I can't imagine somebody being picked up and moved by a big guy, So I agree that we learn over time. And when people from different groups start to be empowered and start to be able to have voice and say, this isn't really appropriate. Couldn't say that 10 years ago because we would have been dismissed, but this isn't really appropriate. We're seeing that with the Me Too movement. We're seeing that with certainly in the LGBTQ2S plus communities. What's appropriate language? What isn't appropriate language? And yes, some people are going to say, oh, well, it's just guys. And so maybe when you're hanging out with your buddy, maybe guys is okay. But if you are hanging out with somebody where that's inappropriate, start to take it out of your language. I remember when I was dating a Black fellow and he says, well, you can use the N-word. I said, oh, no, I can't. No, I can never use that word. It's absolutely inappropriate. So thinking and not using it in an awful way. He was thinking of using it in the way the community uses it. It's totally different. But that's the thing, let's look at pronouns. So many people are, oh my God, I can't get my head around pronouns. And I am a grammar queen, so it drives me crazy to use a plural pronoun for an individual, but you know what, get over it. And so when I was teaching at the university, I would ask students, if you have a preference for your pronoun, you can tell me now if you're comfortable with that, or you can come up to me after class. Tell me what it is, and I will make every effort to use that when I address you in class. So there's small little steps we can take. When I was chairing a committee, if people had told me that they had a particular pronoun, and I would ask, do you want me to tell the group that? They would say yes. And then when we would encourage people to use that pronoun when they were talking to that individual. When we had a person with a visual impairment on the committee, I would then remind people to, when they were speaking, to say who was speaking, say your name and that you're speaking, because he can't see you, so he may not recognize your voice. So it might be nice for you to say, this is Valerie, and here's my comment. So there's just little adjustments like that we can make. It's no skin off our nose to do it. But sometimes we think, oh my, that's just so hard. But we do it every single day. You talk to your grandparents differently than you talk to your friends at a pub, right? We're adjusting our language depending on who we're with all the time. And now we're only saying is that if you're working with a group that's not part of your in-group, maybe think about your language and how it's going to be received on the other end.
Yeah, it's the they and their. If we're talking about somebody and we don't know if they're male or female, then that's how we use our language anyways. Just saying, oh, well, somebody dropped this off and they left it here. And so we use that language. It's just, we don't understand how it could apply. And so we stumble over it and we feel uncomfortable. But I would rather feel uncomfortable than hurtful. That,
Absolutely. And we have French language teachers who are really struggling with this because, of course, some languages are, every noun is feminine or masculine, and students are starting to say, well, how are we gender neutral, doing this in a gender neutral way? And it's, so there's so many things left to do to be respectful in everything we do. But if we can take small steps, and as I mentioned before, even more importantly, look at systemically, how are legal systems impacting people differentially? How is our education system impacting people differentially? All of those systems are what we really need to focus on, because one of the things I always say is, if we could get everybody together, join hands and sing Kumbaya, that would be great. But we would still have systemic racism. We would still have systemic discrimination until we start to unpack those policies, practices, and procedures that really differentially affect. And we've seen that with COVID. Yeah. The differential impact of COVID on Black communities, Indigenous communities, homeless communities. So we really have to think about, how are we responding to people in different cohorts in a way that limits their ability to function.
So if you had a magic wand, Valerie, and you could get organizations across Canada to do just one thing to improve inclusivity, what would your advice be to the organizational level?
Start today building a systemic strategic action plan that is an operational plan for your organization that's based on anti-racism, anti-discrimination principles. If you could build that plan, you resource it with time, the time that's needed, the human resources that are needed, the dollars that are needed, as you would any other aspect of your business, you will find yourself disrupting. And I love that word, disrupting and transforming your organization and being a leader in terms of attracting the best and the brightest, because they will know that this is an organization that's going to accept me for who I am when I come through that door.
Yeah, and support me to do my best work. Are there examples out there of strategic plans or templates that you would recommend to people who say, okay, I'm ready, I want to do it, what do I do?
Yeah, you can go on the internet, as always. There's always great websites that show you step-by-step how to do a diversity equity plan. The CCDI, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, Michael Bach's work, they have an actual toolkit, and it leads you everything from developing the mission statement all the way down to measurement. It's a very, very good tool. And there's several of those out there. There's benchmarks, there's global diversity benchmarks, for example, that give your company opportunities to measure your successes, to look, what is it that I could measure? Because a lot of companies go, well, what am I going to measure? Just how many people are diverse in our seats? No, there's lots of good quantitative measures, but there's also good qualitative measures that you can use. And, some of the ones that we've been using all along, like employee satisfaction, can be rejigged to include equity and inclusion measures. So there's lots of stuff out there. There's lots of really good consultants that can help with this work to get you going on the path. I think work myself out of jobs. My colleagues will hate me for this, but I really do think organizations can work through this themselves if they're really dedicated and committed to it. But sometimes it is good to have somebody from the outside looking in, just to help you see things that you don't see yourself. So, for example, I've had organizations ask me to go through their policies and practices. just binders to see what's there. And then I can point out language. I can point out some things that are creating barriers, and they, oh, I didn't even notice that, because you're so used to seeing it, right? So sometimes it helps to have that outside view. If you're a public entity, like the police service, which I did a lot of training with in my earlier career, it's really great to have, and Calgary Police Service has done this, have advisory committees from different communities, creating trust, creating transparency, getting people to say, well, this is what our experience is with working with this entity, and what kinds of things can be done to make sure it's a more positive experience that people are gaining from your organization. So there's things that you can do that cost money, and there's things that you can do that are free. I tell a lot of organizations, you don't have to throw a whole lot of money at this. It really is time and commitment more than dollars, although dollars keeps it going. You've got to put it into your budgets.
But if everybody is, as they are in most organizations, already 100% committed because of the work that they're doing, and they want someone external, what do they look for to know that they're not getting a flavor of the month, let's all feel good, but nothing changes consultant, and that they get somebody who is going to, as you say, embed it in the way business is done?
Well, I'll have to say that there are some huge consulting firms, who I will not name, who have gotten into the game lately, because especially in the last couple of years with Black Lives Matter movement and whatnot, they've seen that there's some dollars to be had. I don't think they have the knowledge and the depth to do the work, but they have the name, and so people will hire them on. I think the best thing you can do is look around your community. You know, in the early days of doing employment equity and such, we were bringing people in from the United States. It was the worst thing we could have done, because they came in with a completely different attitude towards this work. There was a lot of blaming going on, and so people were feeling guilty and defensive, and it shut down this kind of work for a very long time. Organizations just shut their doors and said, no, we don't want you in here blaming and making us feel like we're all horrible racists. So find who's around you in your own community. So if you're in Toronto, guess what? You've got Anima there, Anima Leadership. You've got Shaquille Chaudhry. You've got some other people that have been doing this work for a long time, and not only have the lived experience because they're a member of a equity seeking group, but they've also got the depth and the knowledge, and they've done a lot of their own work in this area. So find people, word of mouth. That's how I get all my jobs, is word of mouth, is people who say, I saw her do this, I saw her do that. Get people who have actually worked in the community. If you're a white woman like me, yes, I've had my own barriers presented to me because of my gender, but I certainly don't know what it's like to be a Black person or an Asian person or a person with a disability. So find people that have actually worked with the community and have worked in those groups. So I've done a lot of work in the Black community in Calgary. I've done a lot of work with Indigenous communities in Calgary. And so you build that word of mouth, you build transparency, you build people knowing that you can be trusted, that you know what you're saying, that you're truthful, all those sorts of things. So I think it's really going to the grassroots, and it doesn't have to be a person with a PhD. I mean, yes, there are very few of us that do this work that have PhDs, but you don't need it. You need somebody who understands the communities, understands the needs, understands the barriers, knows the history, knows why people have been struggling and fighting for inclusion. What is it that's kept them out? All of those things. That sounds like a long laundry list, but really it is finding somebody who is transparent, trustworthy, and has the depth, as my friend and colleague Vilma Dawson will say, has the analysis.
Yeah,
and I love that word, because it means has the analysis. I know what racism means. I know how it impacts people at the mental and physical level. I know how it plays out in their day-to-day lives. I also know that I can only talk about it as a third party. I can't talk about it as lived experience. So I like to bring people in when I'm doing my work that can also bring in the lived experience.
Great. Yeah. To really add that to it, that perspective to it. I do that with everything that I do. Try to find people with the lived experience to share it. Valerie, what about a leader whose organization is not interested in doing an inclusivity strategy or plan, but they themselves want to be better at being inclusive with their team? What kind of advice would you give to them?
Well, if you want to change yourself, but not change your organization, I'm not sure what would be your impetus there. But I think a leader, it'll come organically if a leader is interested in doing this. It's really looking to develop those mentoring, sponsorship, and coaching programs to make sure that you're not bringing into higher positions people that are just like you, which is our tendency. There's a really good video on this about how we make our leadership decisions and how people who are diverse from who we are start getting pushed out to the margins. But looking for that talent and starting to cultivate it and bring it to the table. And then if the people that are at the table, when I was the director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Protected Disclosure at the University of Calgary, what I did, one of the first things I did, and it was partly in place when I got there, was we had a large round table with representatives from across the university. So I went to every single department, administrative staff, faculty, students, asking for a representative to sit on a diversity and equity council. And we ended up with about 60 people on this council. They didn't all attend all the quarterly meetings, but they were kept in the loop and they were champions in their own areas. We had professional development opportunities. So one of our people, for example, the person I said, Dr. Mark Ianco, with a visible disability, he did a session on how to assist him if you were out and he needed some assistance in a good way. Another one of our folks, Dr. Darren Lund, who sadly has just passed, an amazing anti-racist educator, did a session for us on power and privilege that was just knocked people's socks off. So we used the skill sets that we had around the table to educate ourselves, but we also learned how to work together in a way that was respectful of all of the differences that we had around that table, and we had everything represented. So I think that's the thing a leader can do is how do I make sure that I can leverage the skill sets, not only the hardcore skill sets that I hired somebody for, but the stuff they're bringing into the table from their own lived experience, from their own lives. So if I'm, as I was, a woman speaking to an all-male room when I worked with the police service, I could pull on some of that experience as a woman in an all-male environment and sort of some of the things that might have made me feel excluded. I could pull on how they felt in uniform when they were walking out in community, because now they're looked at as blue, not as individuals, but as blue people, as police. So, I think if a leader can start to cultivate that sort of atmosphere, you're going to get people excited. You're going to get people saying, you can see me for beyond the fact that I'm really, really good at computers or whatever it might be. You can see me as a whole person, and you're interested in some of the unique skills that I bring to the table.
How do you manage the concern that we're asking a person in a marginalized group to become the champion or ambassador or expert on everybody in that group?
never do it. That's right. Never pull out the one Black person in the organization to talk about how Black people feel. No, that's one individual with one viewpoint, just like all women. I don't want to represent all women, and all women do not want me to represent them. I'm a unique human being, and anybody in any group is a unique human being. They might be able to give you some insights, but guess what? They're probably tired of giving people insights into their world. It's up to us, whoever is, if I'm not part of the gender and sexually diverse community, then it's up to me to learn about that community. There's all sorts of resources on the internet that have been written by the community people that can educate you. You don't have to go into the community and say, what is it like to be, X, Y, or Z, because it's putting them on the spot. It's also exhausting. It's not their responsibility to educate you. So I tell people, do your own self-education as much as you can. Don't just take the one person in the organization with a disability and say, you're our equity officer, because you should know everything about it. They don't. They're not versed in it. They don't have the analysis. They haven't done the training. They don't have the background. They have the lived experience, but it's not enough. They may not know how to develop a strategic plan. They may not know how to develop anti-racist policy and practices. So we can't make an assumption that just because somebody lives in a particular identity that they're going to be really good at this diversity work. No. So I think, it's like any other position, any other job, hire on merit, hire on the person who has the ability and the skill set to do the job. Now, if I have two candidates for that job, and one is white woman and one is a Black male, I might make the nod to the Black male because my organization is predominantly white. Maybe I will do that. But I would have to be very careful then that individual is supported, that individual isn't set up to take all the blame if nothing works, right? Or that individual is looked on as oh, they're just, banging their own drum instead of that they're an expert in their area. So I think there's a lot of things that need to be unpacked when you're thinking about somebody doing this work and the support that they require, because it's difficult. It's very emotionally and psychologically difficult work because there's a lot of backlash to it. Mm-hmm. And so I always surrounded myself with people that could be supportive and that you could whine to, that you could, that you were really able to go and say the truth to and say, what do I do? Pull me off the ledge. And so I tell some of the younger people coming into this business, surround yourself with some people where you can get together even once a month or every couple of months, and every one of them is going to be pulling you off the ledge at some point in time. It's really important to have that support, and it's important that the organization gives you that kind of support when you're in that kind of role as well.
Yeah, and a lot of that is managing expectations up front with the role, with the leaders, and making sure they understand how you're going to disrupt and what the value and benefit is to that disruption, and not see that as you causing waves, but rather that you're actually helping to level the playing field. Valerie, with team members, we sometimes see something, I call it bullying the bully, where I watch someone that I believe is intimidating or stigmatizing someone, and I get all up in their face. Well, now I'm engaging in the same behavior I'm trying to stop because right. I'm shaming and blaming that person. What would you say to the average employee who wants to intervene, who wants to be helpful, but it's not directed at them? What would be your advice on how to have a civil conversation, how to be helpful?
Yeah, there's a lot of techniques out there for this. And some of the ones, don't call the person out on the spot and embarrass them or humiliate them in front of other people, because it's just going to create defensive if it's safe, and that's the first thing I tell people is if you feel safe to do this, then take the person aside at some point and say, what you said there, I really felt uncomfortable with that. Did you intend? Assume the person was not intending to be hurtful, because oftentimes they're not. They didn't hear it. And I remember being at lunch with a friend of mine who is Black, and I said something, and as soon as it came out of my mouth, I kind of heard it, and I went, "Oh my gosh!" And she turned and looked at me, and she says, "What did you just say?" And I said, I don't know where that came from, and I apologized. And instead of getting defensive, I apologized for it. So assume somebody, and she was gracious about it because she knew that wasn't what I intended. But assume the person isn't having an evil intent, that they've just said something that in the heat of the moment. In the heat of the moment, that's when our limbic brain gets involved, our emotions get involved. And yourself, when you've had an argument with somebody, your emotions are heightened and you're saying things that you don't even mean. And then you walk away, you take a breath and you go, "Oh my goodness, I could have said this, or I could have said it differently, or I could have done this." And that's because your frontal cortex is coming in. So when we're in an emotional state, we will say all sorts of things, and they're coming from our primitive brain. They're coming from that unconscious bias. And we might say things that we would never believe or say, but we're mad or whatever it is, right? So if you can tell people, if they're in that state, take a breath, walk away, get your, before you confront somebody. That's really a positive thing to do, so that you're not angry when you're taking somebody aside and say, and bring it to yourself. I felt uncomfortable when you said that. Now, if it's something that you don't feel that the person's going to receive, or you've tried it before, then you take it to a supervisor and you hope that they're going to know how to deal with it, because it should not be left, because that person that was the target of that is the one that's sitting out there on the outside now, feeling excluded. So if you can't do any of that, the most simple thing you can do is go to the person that was targeted and say, "I saw what happened. I'm really sorry that happened to you. Is there anything I can do?" And I have heard this over and over and over for people in community where they have been targeted in a grocery store. Somebody's called them a slur or something, and they'll say, "People were standing around and nobody did anything." Well, the least you can do in that situation is go up to the person and say, "I saw what happened. I'm so sorry. It wasn't right. Is there anything I can do?" So I think those are really good strategies. There's lots of others. One of my police officers in one of my workshops, he said when somebody told him a joke that relied on a racial or gender or some kind of stereotype to make the joke funny, he would look at them and go, "Why is that funny?" And then they'd have to say, "Well, it's because," and then they would play out the stereotype. And he would, "Well, I've seen lots of people that aren't like that from that group," and so he would just start to deconstruct it, and people would just back off because they'd have to explain it. And by the time they explained it, there a little bit of a light bulb went on that, "Oh yeah, it's funny because I'm relying on a stereotype." So I thought that was an interesting strategy too.
Yeah, well, because you're getting people to think rather than just shaming them. You're
That's
getting
right.
them to think about what they said.
Yeah, you can't shame people into doing good behavior. Maybe back in the day, I always think that guilt and shame are things that have kind of been lost. There was a time when a community could shun somebody, but it doesn't really happen in the same way anymore. And so I don't think shaming works in that way. I think it's better to educate. It's better to get people to feel it, feel that, "Oh, yikes, I didn't mean to hurt somebody's feelings. Oh my goodness," we really don't. And so it takes somebody to say, "Gosh, did you really mean to say that? Was that your intention?" Or, "I didn't expect something like that to come out of your mouth." Right? I take it away from the individual. In a classroom situation, I would have a student say something that might have been racist or sexist or something. the last thing you want to do is say, oh, that's a very racist comment to the student. You want to say, oh, a lot of people feel that way. Let's look at that. Let's try to understand why people might feel that way. So you take it away from the individual and you turn it into a teaching point. And you can do that in your day-to-day life too. I mean, if your husband or your kid or your wife or sister or whoever comes to you and says something egregious, you can say, oh, well, I've heard other people say things like that. I wonder what that means. Like, let's talk about what that means. And maybe you'll get people thinking, and maybe you'll get them to shut down. But I found with students, but they're motivated in different ways than family members, right? That they were willing to then have that conversation. So, yeah.
Yeah, really great advice for those who want to help, who want to step up, but to do it in a way that really is helpful. And Valerie, what about the person who is the target but does not feel safe? So they've maybe just started a job, they're not going to say anything, they're not going to. How do they protect their own psychological safety?
That's a really hard one. We all know what it's like to be bullied, I think, at some stage in our life, and how do we stand up to that, especially if it's something that happens every day. For me, I step into a bully's space. I'm like I said, 5'1", but I'm tough, and I'll step right into their space, because I find if you step into a person's personal space, it backs them up. It gets them uncomfortable. I don't recommend people do this unless you're doing it deliberately, because personal space is one of those communication differences that we have to respect. But if somebody's is being a bully to me, I step right into their space, and I don't care if they're 6'4" and I have to stretch to look up at them. It really does knock people off their heels. My friend, Dr. Linda Knettiman, who is a Black woman, very strong, very assertive. When I've seen her deal with it, some of the things that people say to her, she does it in such a gentle way. She just goes up and says, please don't say that. It's not very appropriate. Just very gently. Not everybody has that ability to do that. And we certainly see that with younger women experience sexual harassment and those sorts of things. So, if you can find somebody that you trust, it's at least useful to vent and to share your experience. Definitely record it, write it down somewhere. This happened at this time, on this day, by this person, and this is what happened, because then you keep a record. And certainly we know that in organizations, the more that you have recorded and written down, if you take the complaint to human resources, you're going to have the record that they need to investigate. So at least do that, even if you don't use it. I had an open office policy. Even when I wasn't doing this work, people got to know that I was somebody you could go talk to about this. And I would have people in my office just telling me their stories. It wasn't my role at that time. I had no authority to do anything. But what I would do with their permission, if they wanted to take it further, is then I would approach a supervisor or something and say, this has happened to this individual. So I would be their voice if they had given me that permission, or I would bring it to the attention of a council member. This was when I was working for the city. So I would take it to a council member and say, this is happening in this business unit. This is something that maybe you need to talk to the EO about. So there's various strategies you can have so that you're not the one that's having to take it forward. But being very clear that the person you take it forward to always gets your permission before they take it further, because it has to be your decision whether you want to take it further or not. But at the least, just record the incidents, definitely, because then you can see a pattern.
Great. I also want to ask you how you might describe psychological health and safety, including inclusion, to someone who really doesn't get it and you need to do it on a very grassroots, common sense level.
I think what I would say is that as human beings, we want to feel safe in our interactions with others. We want to feel accepted for who we are as unique human beings. We want to have our voices heard. We want people to hear us when we have something to say in a respectful way. And so the more that we can create an environment where those things are possible and where people feel that their opinions, their thoughts, their goals are included in decision making at the organizational level, so that it's not just coming down from the top as an edict, but you've been consulted, that the employees have been, what would you like to see? So one of the first steps in any of this is talking to employees and seeing what their experience is and what they want to see happen. So I think the more that we listen to people and hear what they're saying, that we make sure that when we hear what they're saying, that we make some commitment to act on it in some way, or, we're not able to do that because of these reasons, or, well, that's a good suggestion, we're going to follow that up. I think that's what people need. Just think about what you want from your friendships and from your families. I grew up in a dysfunctional family, and one of my friends grew up in a very functional family. We were talking about it on the other night, and we were doing a little card game about what were some of the struggles. She said, I didn't have any. I had this wonderful childhood. Everything was perfect. Blah blah blah. And I'm going, I hate you, but I became part of that family because of that reason, because I thought, wow, I'd never seen anything like this in my life. This is what it is to be accepted. This is what it is to be treated with respect. This is what it is for people to have conversations that are amiable, right? So I think if you think about what the things that you need to feel good in your families, in your friendships, in an organization, you'll find that that's what psychological safety is. You'll find that that's what inclusion is. I can come to the workplace in the morning and I'm going to have a smile on my face because I know I'm going to see my coworkers who I absolutely love. And you're not going to love every one of them, of course, but I really like being there because I have fun and people accept me, and I can be as wonderful and weird and unique as I am, whatever I am that particular day. And people will get it. And if I'm having a bad day or I'm having a cranky day, people aren't going to say, oh, she's such a word. But, oh, are you okay? You're not yourself today. Checking in. Psychological safety, mental health, checking in. If somebody looks like they're not quite the way they usually are, check in. That's all. I had a boss. This guy was amazing. He probably had about 300 reports in different area offices as well. And he made every month he managed to see every one of those people. He would pop in for 5 minutes into your, how are you? He would remember that I had 2 dogs, 2 cats. He'd go next door and he'd remember their kids' names. He must have had a huge Rolodex or something. I don't know how he did it. But man, did you ever feel included? And he would just ask, is there anything that I could do to make your world better? Wow. One of the best bosses I ever had, just very committed to showing up and valuing his employees, even in a very short conversation.
That it really, like you say, 300 people, most of us would not have that many direct reports, but 5 minutes once a week doesn't seem like too much to ask. And yet that attention.
And they weren't direct reports because he was a GM, but they were his people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So he showed up there. Well, that's great. Any last words that you want to share to the listeners, Valerie?
I just think whatever your role is in the organization, it doesn't matter what your role is. I don't care if you're VP or you're the receptionist or a janitor. Whatever your role is, first of all, treat people on an equal level, that not a hierarchical level, because you'd be amazed who holds the skeletons in organizations. But also, every one of you can be a leader when it comes to driving inclusion and equity. And I've seen it in action where our receptionist, for example, sat at a high desk, and we had people coming in from the community, a lot of them seniors, a lot of them with mobility issues. And she said, I can't sit up here because they need to sit down and they need to see me face to face. And she advocated for a desk that they could wheel up to if they were using a wheelchair. Anybody can look around and say, there's something here that could be changed, that would make it more equitable, that would make it more inclusion. So don't wait for your leaders to do this. Don't wait for middle management to mandate this. Look around yourself, no matter what your role is in your organization, and go, what would make even my life easier if, we want to work on self-interest, but also I just saw that didn't work for that individual. What would a fix be? And who could I take that to make that suggestion? That would be my last words of wisdom, if you will.
And they are very great words of wisdom. Valerie, it's been such a pleasure. The video clips will end up on LinkedIn and other social media, and the podcasts are on our psychealthandsafety.com website when they're out there. And I'd just like to thank you so much. This has just been a pleasure learning from you and listening to your ideas and your tips today. So thank you for being part of this.
Thank you for inviting me. And it's a wonderful thing that you're doing here. I think it's great to help people understand some of these issues. Thank you so much for your work.